focuses on the relationship between diplomacy and religion, ecological sustainability, interconfessional engagement. He is an associate professor and the director of the Grace School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University in Chicago. Wellman is the author of Sustainable Diplomacy, Ecology, Religion, and Ethics in Muslim-Christian Relations, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2004. His more recent work has focused on European Union integration, non-state actor and grassroots diplomacy, and the role of religious culture in building bridges across boundaries of difference. Wellman's current research focuses on urban diplomacy among non-state actor and grassroots practitioners in Paris and Chicago.
Thank you so much, Takara. Lovely introduction to my good colleague, David. And allow me to invite him now to speak to us on the role of citizen diplomacy in the promotion of democracy. And just one quick organizational word. This is a shorter keynote session, but nonetheless, if you do feel so moved, you can go to the Q&A portal at the bottom and write in your question for David there. And if we have time at the end, we'll most certainly ask your question of him. So David, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, both Takara and Jeff. And I'm just delighted to be here, and I've enjoyed so much the interventions that we've gotten to hear so far. I'd just like to begin by saying, while the recognition of the importance of citizen diplomacy is hardly new to the field of diplomatic studies, more recent scholarship has explored on a far more granular level the wide variety of roles and contexts in which non-state actor and grassroots diplomats have served to influence and enrich human relations. As Kostas Konstantinou, Noi Kornago, and Fiona McConnell note in their pivotal 2016 text, Transprofessional Diplomacy, quote, "Diplomacy is no longer restricted to a single vocation, nor implemented exclusively through interaction amongst official representatives. The transprofessionalization of diplomacy," they point out, "reflects the expanded diplomatic space and the intensified pace of global interconnections and networks, and the new possibilities they unleash for practicing diplomacy in different milieus." This observation, of course, these assertions reflect what Kostas Konstantinou said in his piece, Everyday Diplomacy, Mission, Spectacle, and the Remaking of Diplomatic Culture, when he wrote, quote, "Diplomacy can be broadly understood to emerge whenever someone successfully claims to represent and negotiate for a territory or a group of people or a cause, or successfully claims to mediate between others engaging in such representations and negotiations. In this regard, diplomacy ceases to be a professional skill or special technique, and thus captures a wider spectrum of social activities. As we consider the increasing stresses that democracies face across the globe, my remarks aim to address the following questions. 1, what are some of the key roles citizen diplomacy can and should play in efforts to challenge the rise of illiberal democracy and the power of authoritarian regimes? 2, what are the specific skills and insights that citizen diplomats bring to the table, which their state-sponsored counterparts either do not have or cannot exercise? 3, what are some of the most common strategies employed by those who work for the establishment of illiberal systems? And how can they best be countered with the insights citizen diplomats provide us? And finally, what are the best ways to invite a deeper level of collaboration among state-sponsored, non-state actor, and grassroots practitioners of diplomacy in order to link their efforts and amplify their effect in the name of supporting democratic systems? The political scientist Barbara F. Walter argues that a healthy democracy relies on a solid foundation comprised of the following elements: constraints on executive power, a strong legislative branch, an independent judiciary, a functioning rule of law, a free and open press, and a competitive political environment without restrictions on voting or constraints on the impact of voting. And of course, these are ideas that were referenced in our first keynote by Andy Knight. Walter goes on to note that one of the pivotal developments that leads to the erosion of such democratic building blocks are leading political parties caring less about policy and more about identity, a trend that has repeated itself across an increasing number of countries as of late, including the United States, Brazil and India, Hungary, Poland, Sweden, Italy, and France, to name but a few. One of the common threads which run through the political realities of all the countries I've just named is the presence of what Walter refers to as ethnic entrepreneurs. Leaders who are adept at cultivating, expanding, and leveraging the fear of ethnic, racial, religious, or national difference by dominant groups in order to amass and consolidate political power. Foundational to such power is therefore not only fear, but the cultivation of grievance, a privileging of special identities, and a historical narrative which affirms the perception that such dominant groups' right to rule is not only the norm, but a morally justifiable arrangement. Now, growing economic inequalities, which are present in all the countries where such an approach has proven effective, have served to deepen the potency of such a strategy and have accelerated the rise to prominence of those who use them among larger and larger percentages of national populations. Walter cites the late Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic as a prime example of an ethnic entrepreneur. But more recent events have revealed the centrality of such a strategy in the tactics of Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Jair Bolsonaro, Narendra Modi, Giorgia Meloni, and Andrzej Duda, as well as leaders of many rising parties, such as those at the forefront of Sweden's Sweden Democrats, France's Rassemblement National, or Germany's AfD, to name but a few. To what degree can state-sponsored diplomacy alone push back against the strategies employed by ethnic entrepreneurs? In an article published last month, Stanford's Larry Diamond notes that the incentives to democratize, which more powerful nation states, such as the US, most readily have at their disposal, are the use of diplomatic engagement backed by economic and military power, trade, investment, and technological cooperation, tempered by what Diamond refers to as the essential democratic norms of mutual tolerance and restraint. At the same time, he advocates that nation-state policymakers should approach target countries with empathy and strive to understand the ideologies, emotions, anxieties, and ambitions that motivate other states. While the circumstances of each nation-state engagement are unique, one must ask, to what degree can such state-sponsored efforts, which are most often aimed at influencing the leadership of another country, can succeed in affecting the predispositions of people on the ground, especially those who are already inclined to support illiberal leaders? In particular, one must ask, to what degree can state-sponsored diplomacy alone counter the efforts of ethnic entrepreneurs to weaponize ethnic, racial, and religious difference in order to gain and consolidate power among their own domestic populations? Now, there are a number of multiple factors which render a significant portion of a national population vulnerable to the entreaties of leaders advocating for the development and expansion of illiberal political systems: unemployment, growing economic inequalities, resource scarcity, inflation, the results of climate change and the COVID pandemic, and other factors which serve to destabilize what were previously seen as normative realities. All of these arguably contribute to increasingly fraught and complex circumstances. These factors are all multiplied by the weaponized use of social media, as well as the efforts of some mainstream media outlets which broadcast misinformation in league with or controlled by illiberal actors. In the face of such complexities and the perception of such powerlessness, many average citizens become attracted to deceptively clear-cut and simple solutions. For example, many who voted in the recent Italian elections for the Brothers of Italy cited as a significant part of their motivation the clarity and ostensible simplicity of Giorgia Meloni's message, which, quite similarly to that of one of her close allies, Viktor Orban, focused on the need for, quote, respect for national sovereignty, defense of the natural family, and Christian identity. In this regard, Meloni's ethnic entrepreneurship goes beyond Milosevic to leverage not only the discomfort of some Italians with the increasing presence of African and Middle Eastern immigrants, but also the perceived cultural threat of the rising visibility of LGBTQ people, or challenges to traditional gender roles. Along with Meloni and Orban, this latter focus is one also embraced by a diverse cross-section of contemporary populist and authoritarian leaders, including Bolsonaro, Putin, Xi, and Duda, among others. How then are citizen diplomats to resist states moving in the direction of illiberal democracy, or those which are already living under the leadership of authoritarians, especially those as powerful as a Xi Jinping or a Vladimir Putin? And here in the US, how can citizens constructively counter the perceptions or undercut the influence of the tens of millions who remain firmly under the thrall of Donald Trump, or those who are already vying to inherit his mantle? Given the preponderance of illiberal and populist leaders who use the role of ethnic entrepreneur to galvanize their followers, to divide domestic populations, and to leverage fear and grievance to obtain office, I would like to turn now to a group of organizations created and led by citizen diplomats who use a variety of approaches which place them under the category of what I refer to as entrepreneurs of pluralism, a category of citizen diplomatic actors who are driven by their desire to support institutions and practices associated with democracy. At the same time, all of these groups, whether by design or as a welcome byproduct of their efforts, undercut the central goal of the ethic entrepreneur, as their efforts create spaces where people of different ethnicities, races, religions, and economic classes can come together, hear from and learn from each other, and collaborate and build networks to amplify their messaging and goals. The Hague Journal of Diplomacy's John Millison has observed that citizen diplomacy can be the metaphor for the democratization of diplomacy, with multiple actors playing a role in what was once an area restricted to the few. The following groups not only embody the democratization of diplomacy Millison has described, their work also has important implications for those who seek effective strategies for promoting democracy among domestic populations. Some of these groups are quite well known, and others currently inhabit a much smaller footprint. What unites all of them, however, is that their work is emblematic of an emerging and highly effective form of citizen diplomacy, one which is being used to build networks that support both activist efforts and civil society NGOs, to build bridges across boundaries of ethnic, racial, religious, economic, and national difference. The first group I'd like to mention is the Paris-based youth-led NGO Coexiste, which was founded in 2009 and began as an interfaith group, whose goal was to create a space for French youth of all religious traditions to meet, learn from one another, and form networks to amplify a practical message that working and living together and honoring difference is not only desirable, but an engine of social transformation. Coexiste's message is one that must address Coexiste's message says that one must address fear of religious, racial, and ethnic difference simultaneously. To date, Coexiste has facilitated the meeting of over 150,000 young people across France, Belgium, and Germany, and has created friendship networks that today reach into both the private and public sector, with members who are dedicated to promoting the power of pluralism expressed in concrete policy proposals and actions. Next, I'd like to commend the African Middle Eastern Leadership Project, or AML. This is a Washington, D.C.-based NGO which was founded in 2016 by the Sudanese human rights activist Mohammed Abu Bakr. AML has created a network of millennial leaders across the Middle East and Africa who reject the position of those who say that peace and collaboration across boundaries of ethnic, racial, and religious difference are not possible. AML teaches young people how to advocate strategically for democracy and push back peacefully against those who use violence and fear to divide people. The organization has also created the AML Institute, a virtual school where teachers equip students with practical knowledge and skills so that they can carry out their civil society activism and counter sectarian violence more safely and effectively. AML invites leading scholars and practitioners such as Nicholas Opio of Chapter 4 Uganda, who will appear in our conference tomorrow, and Larry Diamond, who I mentioned earlier, to be the teachers and mentors of these students around the world. The AML Institute shares best practices with a highly diverse group of emerging young leaders so that they can in turn promote the values of democracy and human rights on the ground in some of the most authoritarian countries in the world. Next, I'd like to mention the Repairers of the Breach, an American organization founded by the African-American minister William Barber. Repairers is a nationwide movement whose aim is to reframe through action and education the way the moral claims of Christianity are understood in the United States. It offers a direct and powerful challenge to the far-right interpretations of Christianity, which dominate the discourse of many illiberal and authoritarian movements across the globe. Repairers of the Breach takes the position that the preeminent moral issues for Christians are not prayer in public schools or abortion or property rights. Rather, the key issues are how our society treats the poor, women, children, workers, immigrants, communities of color, LGBTQ people, the ecosphere itself and the sick, or to use the language of Barber, the people whom Jesus calls the least of these. Repairers of the Breach argues that Abrahamic moral traditions point to equal protection under the law, the desire for peace within and among nations, the dignity of all people, and the responsibility to care for the earth, which the repairers describe as our common home. Those involved in repairs of the breach are not limited to those who are associated with Christianity and include Muslims, Jews, indigenous Americans, Buddhists, Hindus, and atheists. In Berlin, the group Über den Tellerrand, founded in 2013, uses culinary diplomacy to bring refugees and immigrant communities together with native-born citizens to create opportunities for personal exchange and friendship. Through cooking together, among other activities, the network this group has created aims to contribute to the creation of a more open and tolerant society through leveraging the fact that everyone enjoys eating. Über den Tellerrand is currently active in over 35 cities in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, the Czech Republic, Colombia, and the United States. Next, I'd like to note the Compassionate Listening Project, which began in 1990 in Seattle. Based on the work of the Quaker thinker Gene Knudsen and led by the Jewish organizer Leah Green, this group teaches the practice of active listening and teaches the value of remaining silent and listening for the facts, feelings, and values being presented by those sharing narratives with their group. The Compassionate Listening Project leads delegations to Israel-Palestine, where its practitioners sit with Israelis and Palestinians from across a broad ideological spectrum and listen to their experiences and insights. Whether it is the leaders of Hamas, right-wing Israeli settlers, members of Rabbis for Human Rights, or Palestinian farmers and their families who have been displaced from their land, compassionate listening practitioners engage in active listening in a manner designed to allow many people to experience for the very first time being demonstrably listened to in a non-judgmental and uncritical manner by people from groups and identities radically different than their own. In some cases, individual efforts by single citizen diplomats have resulted in the creation of organizations and institutions with a transnational or even global impact. Such is the case of Eben Hobson, an Inupiaq native Alaskan. A former construction worker and later mayor of a small Alaskan town, Hobson founded the Inuit Circumpolar Council, an organization dedicated to the unification of Inuit voices throughout Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Russia. The ICC is today an organization with over 180,000 Inuit members. The ICC's efforts have long been led not by the motivation to establish a state, but rather the promotion and protection of environmental and cultural integrity across multiple Inuit communities and their attendant language groups. The ICC's work has included countering oil companies' efforts to claim ownership over Inuit lands and led to indigenous voices becoming far more prominent at the UN. The ICC was accredited in 1983 to ECOSOC, the UN's Economic and Social Council, and achieved a significant impact on Canadian foreign policy with regards to the Arctic. And then, of course, there is Jokan Arputam, an Indian community leader and activist, known for his campaigning work of more than 40 years on issues related to slums and shantytowns. Arputam is credited with founding Slum Dwellers International, a network of community-based organizations in 34 countries across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. SDI is dedicated to representing and advocating for its highly diverse membership, who are most often living on the edge of cities in order to access employment. SDI's goal is to ensure that the needs of its members are integrated into the work of city administrations. SDI is active in 478 cities, and while its efforts are decidedly transnational, the principal context of SDI's work is focused on the local level, where its efforts take place in informal settlements, where people on the ground work to build more inclusive cities, economies, and political practices. And finally, I'd like to commend Wangari Maathai, the Kenyan veterinary scientist whose organizing work began with a group of local women in her community who planted trees in response to the growing level of deforestation in their backyards. Using her skills as a community organizer and her knowledge as a scientist, the group she gathered created an organization that eventually planted over 50 million trees in Kenya and inspired similar efforts across sub-Saharan Africa and beyond. Today, Matai's group is known as the Greenbelt Movement, which has created jobs for over 30,000 women in beekeeping, forestry, and food processing, and has built lasting bridges across boundaries of national, ethnic, and religious difference. Now, these groups are all but a few of many other groups who are accomplishing on the ground what state-sponsored diplomacy would be hard-pressed to realize. While many might conclude that some of these organizations are simply activist efforts, such a conclusion belies the very sophisticated level of diplomacy which has been employed to draw together and maintain such broad and diverse coalitions. Such a conclusion would also serve to obscure the innovative approaches being employed by a growing number of these groups, which are potentially useful to diplomats at every level. One such innovative approach is what I call interconvictional diplomacy. Coined by the French physicist François Becker, the interconvictional concept emerged out of the work of Western European interfaith groups, in recognition of the fact that a significant percentage, if not the majority of Europeans, are in fact secular. Those who use this term understand atheists, agnostics, and practitioners of religious traditions as absolute equals, who all have equally valuable moral convictions which drive their choices and actions. To promote interconvictional cooperation is thus an effort to identify congruence in the moral claims of diverse individuals and groups, and use the agreements regarding goals and ethical practices to build highly diverse collaborative communities. Interconvictional diplomacy, as practiced by these citizen diplomats, is thus, in Becker's view, an effort to engage the spiritual dimension of human relations, and invites people to consider the fact that those who claim an affiliation with a religious tradition have not cornered the market on having a spiritual understanding of reality. This work is premised on the belief that identifying, naming, and drawing on shared values of ostensibly very different groups taps into sources of power which are not based on materialist factors and which defy realist assumptions regarding the nature of power itself. These are, according to Becker, potent sources of motivation, which diverge from traditional sources of power often associated with state-sponsored diplomacy. The shared values by the groups I have cited, be they the value of honoring the earth, or community building, or ethnic, racial, and religious diversity, or shared regional identity, or the distribution of vital resources, or celebrating the arts, or welcoming the stranger, or standing toe-to-toe against extreme poverty. All of these are shared convictions which invite the possibility of collaboration, coordination, and networking. The practice of grounding approaches to citizen diplomacy in such shared convictions has proven to be highly effective in gathering people to engage in common causes. And the numbers of people participating in the efforts of the ICC, Coexiste, Slum Dwellers International, or Greta Thunberg's climate strike movement can attest to this. The success of such work relies foundationally on the practice of the intimate person-to-person forms of diplomacy described by Constantinu's everyday diplomacy. It is diplomacy on this scale, among people on the ground, who understand in granular detail the specific circumstances of their neighbors, which holds some of the greatest potential to effectively counter the work of those whose efforts are aimed at undermining democratic systems of governance. Here in the United States, those who seek to undermine the integrity of electoral systems employ multiple strategies. These include systematic efforts to undermine access to voting, the drawing of districts to diminish the power of racial minority groups, and the use of social, and in some cases, mainstream media outlets to diminish people's confidence in the electoral system. While some of these efforts are not new, the phenomenon of denying the outcome of elections, championed by a former president and the majority of an entire party, have accelerated a number of trends, which arguably serve to call into question the long-term sustainability of American democracy. In their 2021 report on the global state of democracy, the Stockholm-based think tank International IDEA labeled the United States a backsliding democracy, based on the categories of decline in effective parliament, inclusive suffrage, and social rights and equality. The report cited the increased instances of gerrymandering among districts which undermine equal representation, the increasing polarization among political parties, and unregulated campaign finance. The report goes on to note the negative impact of diminished media integrity, as well as measurable declines in civil liberties. Furthermore, given the enormous expense involved in running national and even statewide campaigns in the US. The fact that many large American private sector actors continue to donate tens of millions of dollars to candidates who have actively denied the legitimacy of Joseph Biden's election to the White House is a significant barrier to reforming the system. As we move into the final weeks of the election cycle here in the US, those who work on campaigns agree that one-on-one conversations between citizens remain the most effective means of inviting people to willingly receive new information, as well as choose to actively participate in the electoral process. Herein lies the centrality of everyday diplomacy in working to affirm the integrity of representative democracy, of bridging partisan divides, or countering apathy grounded in the very false conviction that one's vote does not matter. One might ask why it is important to apply the title of citizen diplomat to those who do such work, and why it is important for those engaged in such practices to understand themselves as practitioners of diplomacy. Now, for one, claiming the role of citizen diplomat opens the door to accepting the invitation to improve one's skills in mediation, negotiation, and active listening. It also makes a space for those advocating for democracy to adopt additional practices associated with the effective practice of diplomacy in order to improve the effectiveness of their efforts. These include increasing efforts to improve one's cultural literacy, becoming interested in additional language acquisition, becoming acquainted with competing interpretations of history, acquiring a more sophisticated understanding of political and economic systems, and of course, understanding oneself more readily, not only as an advocate for one's own position, but also having the capacity to be of service to communities and groups other than one's own. In other words, to willingly enter into liminal spaces that diplomats often occupy, in order to become what the scholar of diplomacy Paul Sharp calls the useful stranger. Such are the skills that will not only serve the practitioner in their efforts, but also equip them to more readily identify their allies, and among those allies, those who are fellow practitioners of citizen diplomacy. Now, despite its demonstrable agency, however, it is by no means the case that citizen diplomacy alone will be able to comprehensively push back against the growing wave of illiberal trends in the world. We've already heard from so many reports around the world, there's some incredible developments that no one type of diplomacy is going to be able to address by itself. This fact thus begs the question, what must be done in order to deepen collaboration among all levels of practitioners of diplomacy, in order to work together to support efforts which promote the health of democratic systems and make space for the expansion of democracy in illiberal and authoritarian contexts? Historically, many MFAs of the world's most powerful states have viewed non-state and grassroots practitioners as more often occasional allies rather than long-term partners, people to be called upon periodically and selectively. The time has come to reevaluate the role citizens can play in efforts central to the success of state-sponsored diplomacy, which in democratic countries relies on a functioning set of citizen-driven institutions, which are foundational to a sustainable democracy. Recent trends among EU member states arguably point to the inability of state-sponsored diplomacy alone to address multiple factors which are potentially undercutting Europe's long-term prospects for unity. Were Hungary to apply for EU membership today, it is unlikely that its current level of democracy would qualify it for admission. The same can be said for Poland. The recent Italian elections also opened the door to considering the possibility that the EU's third largest economy may not always be led by a government which supports the pluralistic values upon which the EU was founded, and which are required to be adhered to by the majority of member states in order to maintain the EU's long-term viability. These points are underscored by the likelihood that the number of immigrants coming to the EU in the future will dwarf the number who have already arrived in recent years. And this influx which is being weaponized by multiple nationalist political parties across Europe, both in and out of power. Now, while it's true that the EU wields several economic incentives which guarantee a certain level of cooperation from all member states, one must ask if the long-term integrity of the EU can be ensured by economic ties alone. The work of citizen diplomacy groups on the ground are arguably among the most effective responses to the ethnic entrepreneurship that animates multiple parties across Europe. and which has arguably already diminished the number of EU member states, such as was the case in Brexit. Citizen diplomatic efforts are also opportunities to invite people to consider their common values and shared identities, ties which arguably bind on a deeper level than those forged by a common currency. Among the most challenging current developments in Europe is quite clearly the war in Ukraine, a war which arguably will not be fully resolved in all its implications in the absence of a robust level of effective citizen diplomacy. Currently, citizen diplomacy is playing a central role in millions of refugees being successfully welcomed into neighboring states. The long-term sustainability of systems supporting the welcoming of this wave, the highest level of refugees in the post-World War II era, requires the successful and sustained practice of everyday diplomacy by millions of people across the continent, supported in turn by non-state actor and state-sponsored diplomatic efforts. To maintain this level of cooperation will require a sustained and successful commitment to nurturing what Jeff Weissman has termed polylateral diplomacy, which focuses on relations among state-sponsored and non-state diplomatic actors. At the same time, Weissman's description of what he calls omnilateral diplomacy, focusing on the relationships among non-state and grassroots actors, will undoubtedly prove to be equally important. The EU is thus being invited to explore the requirements for deepening its solidarity among member states and drawing on its common identities in order to build on the unity Russia's incursion into Ukraine has invoked. Citizen diplomacy can arguably also play an important role in the success of such an endeavor by working together through the building of networks and also in collaboration with state-sponsored efforts. Yet while our attention is currently focused on the near term, on wars and elections, a more long-term concern that will not be easily resolved in the absence of a full spectrum engagement of citizen diplomacy has arrived on all of our doorsteps in the form of a global environmental crisis. There are many who would argue that if state-sponsored diplomacy alone were going to adequately address the environmental crisis, it would have done so long ago. Even the most comprehensive state-level commitment to environmental agreements and treaties will not ensure the cooperation of people on the ground, which is essential to the realization of any meaningful success. Nor will state-sponsored diplomacy alone lead us to collectively and comprehensively amend the human economic systems, which many of the most powerful countries are demonstrably committed to maintaining over the integrity of the ecosphere, a choice that has arguably grave implications for the future of democracies across the globe. In the face of these developments, it is environmental activist groups employing the skills of citizen diplomacy, which are resulting in what John Braithwaite and Peter Drahos refer to as the creation of webs of influence. Groups of small, ostensibly weak actors with multiple agendas, relying on a diversity of strategies and mechanisms, becoming collectively strong through linking themselves together. In turn, such fortified strands of groups have the capacity to then link to even larger strands, which come together through ideological or tactical congruence. Such was arguably the case when within a year of one young Swedish student named Greta Thunberg standing alone outside Sweden's parliament, over 1.4 million students in more than 300 cities worldwide marched under the banner of the School Strike for Climate movement. A number of like-minded movements, such as the London-based Extinction Rebellion, are inspired by evidence that once 3.5% of a population are mobilized on an issue, far-reaching change becomes viable. It is seeing the possibility of intentionally bringing about such tipping points, which animate many groups around the world. And what of the role of citizen diplomacy in providing pathways to promote democracy in highly illiberal or outright authoritarian contexts? To what degree can citizen diplomacy impact the domestic political realities of Russia or China or Myanmar or Sudan in the direction of embracing more pluralistic liberal systems? Practitioners of citizen diplomacy are obliged to employ different approaches and tactics when operating in such contexts. Unfolding events today within Iran and Russia reflect the likely presence of networking among grassroots groups and individuals. I am grateful that tomorrow we will be hearing from two dynamic speakers who will share their personal experiences and insights regarding the work of citizen diplomacy under hybrid regimes and authoritarian contexts, the human rights lawyer, Nicholas Opio of Chapter 4 Uganda, and Sudan's former Minister of Youth and Sport, Walaa Essam Al-Bushi, will both be addressing these very questions. And I encourage you to join us for those sessions. The full scope of the roles of citizen diplomacy can play in the promotion, support, and expansion of democracy have yet to be fully defined, let alone mapped out. My own observations are hardly adequate to engage even a fraction of what could potentially be done in this regard. It is for this reason that I am so grateful that our conference includes contributions from so many different voices, joining us from so many different contexts. I look forward to learning from them and with them as our time together during this conference unfolds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That is, I think, the kind of optimistic medicine that we all need in these historic times. And so thanks very much again for introducing us to a number of activist groups that, speaking for myself, do not know much about. And so I'm very, very grateful for the research that you do and bringing the incredible work of these groups and these individuals to light. I do have a question from Ambassador or Professor J.D. Bindernagel, and I'm going to read it to you, David. It is, you mentioned Iran just in your concluding comments a moment ago, but the question touches on Iran. Can the citizens' rejection of Iranian Islamic denial of freedom to choose what to wear, the burqa, or the rejection of the American decision to deny women the freedom to choose healthcare, undermine authoritarian regimes or democracy in America?
Well, I have to say that I believe they can make a significant impact in the direction we're headed. I think it would be presumptuous to say that any one group alone can change the whole ball of wax. But the fact of the matter is that movements that ostensibly appear to us in the popular media overnight are actually on different levels already engaging on the ground. And they come to prominence at a certain moment, and we're quite surprised by some of these. But I think that for those who are involved in such movements, these things have been going on for some time, but there are crystallizing moments or tipping points that I was referring to a moment ago. Now, I would say, certainly, when we see what's happening now on the ground in Iran, the women are now being joined by labor unions and others. And so there is a sort of a layering going on right now with that. I was conversing yesterday with a colleague, an Iranian colleague, who was in contact with people on the ground there. And I asked him if he thought there were particular groups or pivotal organizations that were involved in the current protest. He said not, because so many of those had already been suppressed in many of the ways that Shalja mentioned in what's been going on in India. But frankly, it has been moments where such people have gathered that have been tipping points. I think that when we look, for example, at the issue of reproductive rights here in the United States, it's difficult to ignore the numbers that came out of those primaries in Kansas just a few weeks ago, where registration numbers for people registering to vote, new registrations were 1,000% up. In a very red state such as Canada, such as Kansas, a resolution, a measure that people were voting on as to whether or not to make Canada, why am I making Canada into Kansas? To make Kansas into a state that absolutely forbids abortion, it lost by 20%. And this is a state that went to Trump handily. So I think that maybe these issues right now are capturing a lot of people's imagination. What I think is important now is that if women are showing up to do this work, then it's time for men to show up for these women and amplify what's going on. And that is where we get back to this idea of these strands that I mentioned before, that one group that might by itself ostensibly be unable to make a shift, to make a change, when linked to others, actually a number of strands together can become more powerful than a small state. And so I'm quite optimistic for what is possible. But I think that the time has come now for those of us observing these things to not just be observers, but to be participants in these movements.
Thank you, David, and thanks, JD. I have a quick factual question, which I'm going to respond to, actually, David. Katie asks, can you please repeat the name of the person who coined interconvictional? Katie, that is Francois Becker. If you send an email to Dr. Wellman or to myself, we could send you an article on that subject. So thanks very much for your question. And the final question before we wrap up, David, is from Andy Knight. And now again, in the same way that you are a, let's say, proponent of non-state actor diplomacy, as we know, Andy is a very strong proponent of the United Nations. And he said, do you see a role for hybrid diplomacy that combines and embraces both state-based diplomats with citizen diplomats, particularly if you look at the delegations to the United Nations?
I would respond to that by saying that that is an absolutely essential development that must be built on. I had the privilege of helping to represent the World Council of Churches mission to the United Nations in the 90s, and we helped lead delegations to the Sustainable Development conferences. And I have to say, I was very impressed by the interplay between NGOs and state-sponsored representatives. As somebody working at the World Council, we found ourselves drafting language in our white papers that ended up being adopted by some member states because we represented so many people on the ground, millions of people around the world, that some states looked at the language and thought, well, if this many millions of people can agree on this language, maybe this is language that I can put forward in a UN resolution. Now, that's one level of this kind of cooperation. But the fact of the matter is that we are never going to resolve a problem, as I mentioned, as the environmental crisis, if we do not have a concerted effort on the part of all tracks of diplomacy working together. Because I think obviously one is not going to achieve any kind of meaningful treaties or agreements at the state level that mean anything in the long term if people on the ground are not committed to acting sustainably, if private sector actors are not committed to converting to more green technology. And so this is where we have to work together. And at the same time, I would submit that, track one diplomats, state-sponsored diplomats, have so much to gain by being in closer collaboration with a lot of the citizen diplomats, because it just multiplies the number of eyes and ears on the ground and people that can understand in a more granular level what's going on. And so I think at the same time, I think that a lot more citizen diplomats need to look to state-sponsored actors as natural allies. And so I think the time has come for both sides to see the necessity of working together on a much deeper level. The UN is a wonderful context for that. I think there are other contexts as well, and I want them all to engage in this on a deeper level.
Thank you, David. Another question from, and I don't know whether the question comes from, let's say, a student or faculty or some other professional category, but it is, will a copy of your presentation be made available to attendees? Now, David, you can answer that, of course, but maybe this is the time to pitch to any students who are attending your citizen diplomacy course.
Well, I would actually say our citizen diplomacy course, Jeff, because Jeff and I have the pleasure of teaching together in the spring quarter 2 citizen diplomacy courses. So please join us for that. And it is high time that I add to my other endeavors and put something down on paper and publish it. So I am happy to share what I've written. Absolutely.
Well, David, on that note, I wonder if we can now wrap up. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, and apologies if I've missed any questions from people there. But David, thanks very much for giving us a really terrific tour of the world that you've done so much research on, non-state actor, citizen activist diplomats. And I think that, again, the way you've contributed to sustainable diplomacy thinking and the way you are, I believe, going to contribute to interconvictional diplomacy, I think gives me a great deal of hope for future thinking on citizen diplomacy. So thanks very much, David. And to everyone in the audience, please, we'd love to see you back after a little break. I think we are going to return at 10 minutes to the hour, and the next topic will be reconsidering US democracy and US diplomacy. We have 3 terrific speakers, so we look forward to seeing as many of you as are available at 10 minutes towards the hour. So thanks again, David, and thanks everybody.
Thank you.